On the 22nd of March in 1977, Chuck dropped his daughters off at school and headed to work. His daughters are reported as being the last ones to see him that day, so it can only be assumed that he never made it to work. His absence was noted when he failed to return home at the end of the day, although again, it is unclear if he was officially reported missing to the police at this time. 3 days later, on March 25th, Ruth was suddenly awoken at 2 a.m. by the dog barking. She got out of bed and opened the front door to find Chuck standing there. Ruth described him as looking disheveled, with plastic handcuffs hanging from each wrist and an additional set hanging from his ankle. He was also missing a shoe. Chuck wasn't speaking and motioned to his throat. Ruth asked if he could speak, to which Charles shook his head. She asked if he could write, and after Charles nodded, Ruth grabbed a pen and some paper. Charles wrote that his throat had been painted with a hallucinogenic drug, which could drive him insane, destroy his nervous system, or kill him. Chuck told Ruth that he had been held near Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, where he had been tortured. Ruth wanted to call the police and get medical help, but Chuck refused, saying they would be putting the family in danger. Ruth ultimately agreed and nursed Chuck back to health herself. He communicated with her via notes and began to hint that he had a secret identity as an agent for the federal government. In one note he wrote, "They took my treasury identification," and stated that he had been working for them for around 2 to 3 years. Ruth stated this was the first time she'd heard any mention of the Treasury Department or Chuck working for them. As Chuck regained his voice, he became increasingly paranoid. He began wearing a bulletproof vest and carried a gun at all times. He refused to let his daughters go outside alone and ensured they were driven to and picked up from school each day. Chuck told his father that should anything happen to him, he would leave behind a letter explaining everything, including who was responsible. 2 months later, on June 7, 1977, Chuck would go missing again. On the morning of his disappearance, Ruth took the children to school while Chuck headed to work. In the late afternoon, Chuck called his office from a downtown payphone indicating he would be arriving in around 30 minutes. However, he never showed up. Chuck was ultimately reported missing. 9 days later, on June 14th, Ruth received a phone call from an unidentified woman who only referred to herself as Green Eyes. The woman asked for Ruthie, and when Ruth responded affirmatively, the woman said, "Chuck is all right." Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. After saying this, the woman hung up. This refers to a Bible passage, which in part reads, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." 2 days following this call, on June 18th, Chuck's body was discovered on a dirt road 40 miles west of Tucson. Chuck had been shot in the back of the head and was found lying on the ground next to his Mercury Cougar with his gun located beside him. Items found on and around Chuck's body were unusual. He was still wearing his bulletproof vest that he had insisted on using since his first disappearance. He was also wearing his holster along with his belt, which had a concealed knife in the buckle. A $2 bill with a map drawn on the back and found pinned to Chuck's underwear. The front of the bill contained 7 Spanish surnames with the words Ecclesiastes 12 written above. Arrows pointed to the numbers 1 and 8 within the bill's serial code. The map led to the towns Robles Junction and Salacity, an area between Tucson and Mexico. In Chuck's vehicle, a pair of sunglasses were located that were identified as not belonging to him. Also within the vehicle were several weapons, ammunition, and handcuffs. The vehicle had reportedly been altered in some way so that it could be unlocked from the fender. For English folks, this is the part of the car that frames the wheel well. Also within the vehicle was a note containing handwritten directions to the site of where Chuck's body was found. The handwriting was later confirmed to be his. On the rear back seat of the vehicle, a folded white handkerchief was found. When unwrapped, it was discovered to contain one of Chuck's teeth. It was quickly determined that Chuck had been shot in the back of the head at close range with his own .357 caliber Magnum. The gun was completely devoid of any fingerprints, as was the rest of the scene. The medical examination concluded that Chuck had only been dead for approximately 12 hours before being found, which led to the question of where he had been between going missing on June 7th and his body being recovered on June 16th. Gunpowder residue was found on Chuck's hand. This discovery, along with the shot being fired from his own weapon, led investigators to conclude that Chuck died from a self-inflicted gunshot, and his death was ruled a suicide. Both his wife Ruth and journalist Don DeVille doubted this ruling, with Don stating, "I've never seen in all my years as a journalist a fellow take himself out in the desert wearing a bulletproof vest and shoot himself in the back of the head." 2 days following Chuck's discovery, a woman called the Pima County Sheriff's Department. She called herself Green Eyes and confirmed she was the same person that had called Ruth a few days prior. Green Eyes said Chuck had come to meet her at a local motel shortly before he died. He had showed her a briefcase containing thousands of dollars in cash and told her that the money would buy him out of a contract the mob had put on him. Chuck disclosed that there was a $90,000 contract on his life, which was increasing by $5,000 a day. Police were able to corroborate some of Green Eye's story, finding CCTV that showed Chuck meeting an unidentified woman. It was determined that Chuck had registered at a South Side hotel and met this woman several times. The possibility of an extramarital affair was floating. However, Ruth adamantly denied this, stating that Chuck was extremely loyal to her. It is not clear if Green Eyes was ever identified, but if so, her name has never been released publicly. Despite this further information from Green Eyes, the case was closed on 10th of August 1977, with the official ruling as suicide. Pima County Sheriff's Department officially stated, "We have found no evidence that anyone took part in the death but himself." At the time of Chuck's death, Arizona was the only state that allowed blind trust ownership of real estate. This meant that individuals could buy property anonymously with only an escrow agent, like Chuck, knowing their identity. At the time of his death, Chuck was known to be doing escrow work for 2 alleged organized crime groups, the Ned Warren family and the Joe Bonanno family. In the 1970s, organized crime groups had established Arizona as a pipeline for narcotics and money laundering. The above blind ownership law allowed them to purchase land and properties in which they could launder money through, knowing that it couldn't be traced. Don DeVille had investigated Chuck's death following the case airing on Unsolved Mysteries. He learned that Chuck was involved in money laundering activities through his escrow company and involved in large gold and platinum transactions, which was a more convenient way to launder money. He also discovered that Chuck kept duplicate records of these illicit transactions. Don stated, "He was around the edges of a couple of very large organized crime groups in Arizona at that time. It was very easy to get in over your head, and I suspect that over the years, Mr. Morgan was in that kind of situation. He was doing perhaps upwards of $1 billion of escrow work in bullion and platinum. These were transactions that likely only existed on paper. He was a straight businessman that probably got a little too close to the flame." Following his death, His attorney, Ronald G. Newman, confirmed that Chuck was a secret witness in an extensive land fraud investigation and had testified around the internal dealings at Banco Internacional de Arizona. It is alleged that his testimony was recorded in May 1977, around a month before his death. 2 weeks following Chuck's death, 2 men claiming to be FBI officers turned up at the address of Ruth Morgan, claiming they needed to search the property. Ruth stated they ransacked the house, appearing to be looking for something specific, but did not appear to find it. Don later sent an FOI request to the FBI, an attempt to identify these officers. However, the FBI claimed to have no knowledge of Chuck Morgan. 3 months following the broadcast of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, and after Don Devereux began investigating Chuck's death, a male by the name of Doug Johnston was found shot to death in his car outside of his Phoenix office. Doug was shot in the left side of his head and no gun was ever found. Doug worked and was found dead across the street from Don's office, and the two drove almost identical vehicles. Don strongly believes that Doug was killed in a case of mistaken identity and that he himself was the intended target. A year following Doug's death, Don was contacted by Danny Casolaro, a writer from DC. Danny stated he had information to share with Don about Chuck's illegal gold transactions. However, before they could meet, Danny was found dead in a hotel bathtub with both his wrists slashed. His death was ruled a suicide. There are several theories relating to Chuck's death, the main two being that either he did in fact take his own life after suffering mental health problems and delusions, or that he was in fact involved with the mafia and working for the government, and a hitman ultimately took him out. Don believes the latter, stating, "There is a great likelihood that Mr. Morgan was in fact doing something with the government. I think this was a guy who was extremely naive about a lot of things. I think somebody blew his cover and he got killed." Chuck's wife and daughters have never accepted that he took his own life, and Ruth continued to believe that he was murdered until her own death in 2016. Almost 50 years have passed since Chuck's death, and despite its official ruling of suicide, it remains as bizarre and mysterious as it was in 1977.